This is The Bagel Report, a podcast exploring Jewish representation and identity in popular culture, with your hosts Esther Kostanowitz and Aaron Ben-Moshe, and now a production of J, the Jewish News of Northern California. Aaron.
Esther, we have a guest with us this week.
It's true. It's true. I'm so happy to have this guest. One of the topics that we revisit here regularly at the Bagel Report is how Jewish characters, and especially Jewish women, are portrayed on TV. So when I discovered the work of Dr. Samantha Pickett, author of Peak TV's Unapologetic Jewish Woman, Exploring Jewish Female Representation in Contemporary Television Comedy, I knew we had to bring her knowledge to our listeners.
Samantha, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Before we dive in, for those who don't know Samantha, she is assistant professor of instruction and the assistant director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. She has a PhD in American Studies at Boston University, and Esther and I do not, but I think we still have a lot in common with Samantha.
That's right. That's right. Whatever the opposite of a doctorate is, that's what I have. But in addition to Samantha's book, she has written papers and articles on such topics that sound like they might be actual Bagel Report podcast episodes. So there's Suffering, Stereotypes, and Psychosis, the representation of Jewish femininity in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, Modern Loudmouth, and There's No Such Thing as Christmaka, Seth Cohen, Jewish characters in television Christmas episodes, which I included just for Erin because she's all about the OC.
Because we talk about it like wow, this is like Bashert. This is so crazy. There's so much overlap in the things that we talk about and the things that you write about. And oh my God, we're so excited to have you.
Well, Seth Cohen, I feel like, was a really important, pivotal character for all millennial Jewish women and girls. So
True. That's fair. And then now anytime I see him in any other space, I'm like, this is so great. It's so great to see you. And he was just on Fleischman's in Trouble, and it was great to see him there too.
it was like seeing an old friend. I just wish the best for him.
Isn't that crazy that like you fall in love with a character years ago, and then obviously his name's Adam Brody, but he was Seth in both. So it really did feel like you were saying hi to like an old pal.
Yeah. And I love that he's married to Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl. I love that.
It's truly the best.
I know that Christmaka was created in this TV show, a blend of Christmas and Hanukkah, which I don't know, like we don't have this in our questions, but since it's coming up now, I feel like this is a point at which television just kind of started including Jews in a less in opposition to Christmas and more kind of like alongside it, and kind of there was always whenever there was a Jewish character, people would say Merry Christmas for a full episode, and then somebody say something like, "Oh, and Dr. Goldstein, Happy Hanukkah," and it was just kind of like an afterthought, and also an othering situation at the same time, because it's like, you're not one of us, you observe something else. So
for sure. And I mean, like the Friends episode with the holiday armadillo, like it's such a like othering kind of thing where it's just like, not only is Hanukkah sort of pitted against Christmas, like they're somehow the same thing, but it's so inferior to Christmas that you feel bad for the characters who are forced to celebrate it. And I feel like with the OC, I mean, the fact that they did Christmaka, it was kind of cool because he came from an interfaith family, and it was, I feel like one of the first times on television where you actually had the acknowledgement not only that interfaith families existed, but that like interfaith families actually care about the religious traditions that they come from.
Yeah.
And it's not just a matter of like, well, one's more fun than the other, so we'll just cherry pick whatever works.
Yeah, the best part of that like family dynamic is that Sandy, the dad, who's played by American Dad, who's every dad in everything, he never becomes less Jewish. He's like always talking about how he's like the only Jew in the OC. And that becomes like part of Seth Cohen's identity, which is why it's so important to celebrate Hanukkah and Christmas, which is very cool.
Well, and the thing that's also cool is that the Jews in the OC are actually way more functional and normal than the non-Jews. Like when you actually look at Sandy's family and the Nana and all of the episodes where like we learn more about his kind of background, there's so much warmth and it's really Hamish and like you understand why Seth is so attracted to all of it. And Kristen, the mother, she's like, you know, stereotypical WASP. Her family dynamic is so toxic. Her father is really manipulative and kind of scary and double dealing. And I feel like with that family, it's also a really rare instance in like early 2000s television where you actually have the case being made that not only can Jews and non-Jews sort of just like exist side by side equally and maintain their Jewishness, but that like you actually want to be with the Jews as opposed to the non-Jews. Like the Jews are sort of represented, I think, in a more positive and sort of less toxic, less dysfunctional, more nuanced way.
Absolutely. And your book talks about this family dynamic on TV in so many ways. And it's crazy that the OC was in the 2000s and they were showing this example, but then a decade or so later, you're getting like new TV shows that are still struggling with how do we show Jews and non-Jews existing together without completely assimilating one way or the other. But before we get there, I want to ask you about like your pop culture origin story. Like we talk a lot about what it means to feel seen in pop culture. And we can think of a time where we looked on TV and said, hey, that looks like me. And I want to know if there was ever a moment for you where you felt represented on screen or in a book or in theater. Like, what was that moment for you? Or if it wasn't, what was that like for you?
That's such a good question. I don't know in terms of TV that I necessarily have that. I definitely will say that when I like first watched the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and like discovered Rhoda Morgenstern. And obviously this was, you know, decades after the show actually was on. But when you come to something like, you know, when you're young and you don't really have sense of context, you feel like you're discovering it. I loved her character and I loved how we were supposed to relate to her, even though she was, you know, like less all-American and less together and less perfect than Mary was. Like she was this sort of like loud Jewish woman who was really opinionated and funny and kind of earthy. And we were supposed to see ourselves in her. And like encountering that, I feel like was very special. And, you know, I also think that Seinfeld was such a sort of important part of my upbringing. I came of age just on the tail end of being able, like old enough to actually watch must-see TV Thursdays. And so like I watched the last few seasons of Seinfeld in its original run, and then caught up with everything else in reruns. That dynamic felt so familiar to me. Like my grandparents at the time, they lived in Boca in a place that was just like Del Boca Vista. Every episode where Jerry would go visit his parents, I would just be like, yes, like this is exactly the way that it is. I understand everything that they're saying because I have this lived experience. And I think there's something sort of so funny and special about the way that Seinfeld communicates Jewishness because it's so implicit. And it's not something that's necessarily brought up all the time. I mean, obviously there are episodes where it appears more sort of explicitly than others, but it's always there. And if you know kind of how to read the codes and how to interpret the jokes and, you know, how to sort of, I don't know, immerse yourself in their world because it's also, you know, your world. I think that it's, for me, I would say in terms of TV, one of the like biggest sort of early Jewish viewing experiences where I was like, hey, that's me on TV.
And I love that.
So this idea of the unapologetic Jewish woman, where do you think that originates? Does it start with Rhoda, or it just started with Rhoda for you? But like historically, where do Jewish women start to come into their own as fully fleshed out or nuanced characters?
So we haven't had a great time of it in terms of TV and popular culture. I feel like fully fleshed out Jewish female characters are fewer and further between than they should be. I think that in terms of like a great proliferation of like strong, nuanced, well-rounded Jewish female characters, it's really within the past decade or so. And I think part of that has to do with how TV is changing. And the fact that we have sort of moved on from traditional kind of network and cable models that limit the number of series and who can be making series, and just the way that streaming television works. There's so much choice and so many platforms, and there's so much more diversity as a result, because you actually have the capacity for, basically an unlimited number of series. And so with that, there's so much more opportunity for Jewish female showrunners to actually create shows that allow for them to tell their own stories. And I think like within the past decade, you see series that are created by people like, Rachel Bloom or Alana Glazer and Abby Jacobson, Amy Sherman Palladino. There are so many Jewish women who are sort of taking the lead in creating really smart, really funny, Jewish-centric series that put Jewish women at the center of the stories and don't do the like stereotype thing as much, because they don't necessarily need to appeal to a mainstream audience. They can just appeal to the people who want to watch the series. And I think that's a big sort of change. Like in this kind of Seinfeld era of TV, like network TV, you're always thinking about, how is this going to do in Midwestern markets? Is somebody who's never met a Jew going to be able to care about this or understand this or like these people? And now that we've moved past that kind of era of everybody sitting down on like a specific night at a specific time and watching the same thing, I think that mindset where everything always has to appeal to some sort of imagined like Midwesterner who's never met somebody different from them, I think like we've moved on from that, and that makes it so that we don't necessarily have to be as tied to archetypes that are really one-dimensional and potentially damaging.
That's a great point. I think, there's a lot of what you said is stuff that we've been thinking about for a long time. The idea of the widening of the pipeline so that there's more content, but also, you had said that it's a space where Jewish women who are showrunners can share their stories. But the fact that there are Jewish women showrunners is also like a shift forward, because without women at the helm and telling the stories, you get a different kind of characterization of what a Jewish woman is. I think that there's also a generational shift in how people view Jewish identity, the comfort level that people have in terms of expressing their Jewishness. Can you tell us a little bit about how that reflects in what you study?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the things that is really exciting about contemporary television and really just like contemporary pop culture in general, we seem to be entering a stage where Jewish representation is much less assimilation minded and instead is much more about kind of representing Jewishness as it is and sort of Jewish practice and identity as it is. And one of the ways that this happens or like is done is in the sort of adding of cultural specificity to the depiction of secular Jews. I think that before the like streaming kind of revolution happened, the TV series that you looked at, even ones that had like Jewish characters and did a relatively good job at representing Jews, usually they would only be Jewish for like a very special episode where a character celebrates Hanukkah or Christmas or something, or like somebody experiences anti-Semitism, or they make, a joke about a Jewish American princess at someone's expense, and it kind of communicates Jewishness in that way. And I feel like what's happening now, and you can see it in really like all of the series that I explore in my book, is you have a much deeper sort of sense of Jewish engagement and the idea that being secular or non-observant doesn't mean that you don't engage with Judaism at all. And so we see characters going to services sometimes, celebrating Shabbat, either in their homes or in synagogue. We have, characters actually engaging with Jewish ritual at pertinent life moments, Jewish weddings, sitting Shiva for relatives who die, and, actually doing things at the Shiva houses that are like, according to Jewish ritual, covering the mirrors. We see way more specificity in terms of like kosher foods or Jewish style foods and the kind of inclusion of those kinds of like ways of communicating Jewishness. I mean, on The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, they're not a religious family by any stretch of the imagination, but over the course of the series, like we see them celebrate Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. At one point, one of the characters fasts for Tisha B'Av.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's so much more cultural specificity. Mezuzahs on the doorposts, like things that are both pertinent to the plot and in the set dressing, where it's just like, if you're Jewish and you're watching these shows, you see your sort of experiences, I think, reflected back at you much more so than you would have in something like Friends, for example, where you have 3 out of the 6 main characters are Jewish, and yet it's basically never mentioned. And like Ross is way more Jewish than Monica, even though they come from the same household. And it's like, there's so much about that representation that's like watered down and really has nothing to it in terms of what Jewishness actually is. And I think that we're moving to a point now where whatever level of religious engagement a character might have, their Jewishness is still something that's deeply felt.
I love this. Oh, I love this so much.
We just want to keep you here with us in the Zoom forever. We may just do that, actually.
No, we can't. I'm virtually hostage.
I'm having a great time.
Okay, good. So glad. So we have lots and lots of questions for you. This idea of the unapologetic woman, which is obviously in the title of your book and a very central core thesis. Did you like how I used the word thesis? Like I know what that means. So I think one of the things that we think about when you think about Jewish women on screen, you talked about Abby and Alana, you talked about Midge Maisel, Rachel Bloom, and Rebecca Bunch in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. So are there different types of unapologetic women? Obviously Midge is unapologetic, like career-driven, ambitious, and Abby and Alana are kind of sexually unapologetic and unapologetically non-committal as their generation occasionally is. And I'm wondering how unapologeticness, how much of that comes from white and or financial privilege?
I think in terms of just sort of defining what I mean about unapologeticness, I think, and this is an annoying answer to give, but I think that one of the things that's so striking about Jewish female representation on television now is it's so sort of diverse in terms of what these characters can do, that they have some things in common, a connection to Judaism, a sort of confidence in who they are, a kind of mouthiness and unwillingness to like sit down and sort of stay in their lane. But there's also a lot of differences between them. So like characters like Abby and Alana, or, Julie Klausner's character on Difficult People, those sorts of characters, I think, are much more unapologetic in the sense that they don't struggle with the same kinds of insecurities as a character like Rebecca Bunch, for example, who, even though she defies a lot of stereotypes, she also sort of reads herself through the lens of the same stereotypes. But in terms of the second part of your question, I think that one of the limitations of contemporary Jewish female representation, and really just contemporary Jewish representation in general, is that we're still very much kind of confining Jewishness to this very specific upper middle class, white, East Coast kind of identity, where even though there's more diversity in terms of representational patterns that defy stereotypes, there's not a lot of diversity in terms of where people come from, what kind of background they come from, what they look like, who they are. And that's something that I'm hoping at least can sort of be the next stage of developing the unapologetic Jewish woman, like building on the fact that we're no longer confined to everybody being like either, a sort of like Fran Drescher type or Rachel Green type, and, moving on to something that's a little bit more human and nuanced and relatable and round, but also doing that in a way that reflects the fact that not all Jewish women look, act, talk the same, and come from the same places.
Yeah. And as you say that, 3 out of the 4 women in your book happen to also be Jewish in real life, as their characters are Jewish. How much of the time do you think are unapologetic Jewish women played by Jewish women?
I mean, it's tough because there are a lot of characters that I talk about in the book who aren't played by Jews. And so like Lily Tomlin's character on Grace and Frankie, for example, I think she's such an incredible, reformation of the Jewish mother. Like I love what she does in terms of depicting Jewish motherhood, but Lily Tomlin is not Jewish. Rachel Brosnahan, who plays Midge Maisel, famously isn't Jewish. It seems to me that the characters who are played by Jews tend to be from series where the showrunners actually just play themselves or play the protagonists. And so, like, obviously, Rebecca Bunch and Rachel Bloom, Abby and Alana, Julie Klausner, Julie Kessler, Natasha Lyonne also for Russian Doll. But like, it's, I think, a weird sort of phenomenon. And I think speaks to the fact that I don't know if I'd call it a casting problem, but I do definitely think that there is a disconnect between actually giving Jewish actors the chance to like tell their own stories or reflect their own stories and casting people who look Jewish. And I'm putting that in big air quotes in some sort of way that effectively communicates Jewishness to an audience who will accept that character as Jewish. Because I mean, like none of the 3 adult children on Transparent are played by Jews, but they're all actors who have been cast as Jews multiple times. And it's interesting. I mean, on Glee, Leah Michele, who's not Jewish, played a Jewish American princess character, and Diana Agron, who is Jewish in real life, played like a very stereotypical sort of shiksa cheerleader type. And she played that same sort of character again in Shiva Baby.
Yeah.
And the protagonist of Shiva Baby wasn't played by a Jew. And so I think that we are kind of in a weird sort of moment where we're still, even as we're developing characters who defy stereotypes, we're still sometimes confining ourselves to stereotypes of like, these people can sort of be accepted as Jews because they have features or mannerisms or accents or whatever that communicate that. And so it doesn't really matter if that portrayal is authentic.
Just because their lineage includes Jews doesn't mean that they are more or less qualified to play Jews. Just like people who are in productions of A Few Good Men, they don't have to be a Marine in order to play the role well. But because Jewishness is such like a tricky area where some people think it's a faith, some people think it's an identity, a religion, a culture, a status. There's just so many ways to look at Jewishness that it seems like actually almost impossible to have one characterization that really represents all Jews everywhere.
Yeah. And I think with the casting issue, like I'm not necessarily in either camp where I think that anybody should play, Jews or that only Jews should play Jews. I feel for me, it kind of boils more down to the idea that we should be more concerned with what the characterizations are actually conveying about Judaism and Jewishness than about the actual ancestry of the actor themselves. And like one of the sort of examples that I think about a lot in the book is I talk about like Tony Shalhoub's portrayal of Abe in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. And for me, his mannerisms, his kind of way of communicating Jewish masculinity, it very much sort of falls under the realm of like classic stereotypes of Jewish male effeminacy and sort of ineffectuality. He's sort of nebbishy. And it reminds me a lot of what David Baddiel talks about in his book, Jews Don't Count. He calls it nebbish being, which is such a like great way of describing what it means to sort of put your whole kind of body into communicating this sort of standard representation of what everybody thinks Jewishness is. And like, I'm more concerned with the fact that those sort of like representational scripts that define Jewishness according to these sort of really one-dimensional gendered stereotypes still exist than I am with the fact that it's like a Jewish person or a non-Jewish person engaging with it. Like Tova Feldscha's like portrayal of a very, very stereotypical Jewish mother in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend for me, like isn't any better than what Tony Shalhoub is doing just because she's Jewish and he's not. Like for me, both of them are characters that could use some rewriting.
Okay, so let's talk about this. So the two shows that we end up talking a lot about are Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. One of the things that I didn't necessarily think about when I was reading the book or watching the show until I was reading what you said about it. You said you kind of compared Rebecca Bunch's, her journey in life. You compared it to the trope of the Jewish neurotic man running away from his family to find something else. And then you listed all of these movies that are either Jewish or have a Jewish male just doing exactly that. Like The Graduate, Bye Bye Braverman, Heartbreaking, like all these things. I was like, oh my God, like that's so interesting that that's what you're doing. You're like picking up on Rebecca leaving the things that make her uncomfortable and associating that with her diagnosis, that like the only way that she can kind of manage both is if she kind of leaves it. And I remember watching Crazy Ex-Girlfriend for the first time and going like, oh, this feels very familiar. Like Girl on the East Coast kind of drops all the stereotypes that defined her life. Jewish summer camp, being a lawyer, crazy mom, competitive Jewish best friend, and like just leaves all of it, moves to California, and then through like kind of being removed from that, learns her life. But then also I feel like I don't know if there's a question in here. I'm just like really excited that you brought this up because I feel like it's really specific to millennials and Gen Z who grew up in this very familiar, albeit stereotypical Jewish upbringing. And they're trying to kind of leave it, redefine it, and then return to it. And I don't know, it just feels like it feels like these unapologetic women are specifically targeting an experience that like the generations prior, like Naomi, didn't have.
When you actually look at like the history of it, the origin of both the Jewish mother and the Jewish American princess stereotype comes from the post-war era when American Jews are largely suburbanizing and they're moving out of like insular Jewish urban neighborhoods and into white middle-class suburbs. And they're trying to basically become white, become acceptable to these new people who up until this point had seen them as foreign and other and unwanted. And the sort of level of unprecedented acceptance, not to say that it was like a walk in the park, but like unprecedented acceptance leads to the creation of all of these really pejorative stereotypes that basically boil down to conflicting fears of, well, I'm too Jewish to actually do this, or I've given too much of my Jewishness up and now I'm not Jewish enough and I'm empty. And it's like the Jewish mother is an anchor to a symbolic past who emasculates her sons and ruins her daughters' lives and keeps everybody too Jewish and too sort of tied to that kind of origin. And so, you know, she prevents them from being American enough. And the Jewish American princess is the opposite side of the coin. She's like, everything that's possibly wrong with becoming American, every sort of middle class value that you could possibly criticize is somehow made synonymous with Jewish femininity. So like that sort of assimilation panic, I think, is responsible for the stereotypes that have basically permeated Jewish pop culture from like the 50s through the 2000s. I mean, you still see them now, but I think that like younger generations, some Gen X, especially millennials, even into Gen Z that are now making series, like we didn't grow up in that context. Like we didn't grow up in that generation. And so those concerns are not our concerns. And so I think that one of the things that Crazy Ex-Girlfriend does that's so cool is it takes a character who basically she's an avid consumer of Jewish pop culture. She reads herself through the lens of all of these stereotypes that she's been fed through everything that she's ever known, everybody she's ever met, everything she's ever watched or read or thought about. And then she eventually becomes more comfortable with herself and her identity by peeling away the layers of those stereotypes and just living as a person, which I think is really cool. And I think that's one of the things that is so special about like TV in the contemporary moment, Jewish TV in the contemporary moment, is you have Jewish characters who no longer have to wrestle with like internalized anti-Semitism and shame. Like Jewishness is no longer synonymous with shame and discomfort. It's now just something that exists as a facet of your identity. And it's important, but it's not the focus. And it's also not something that you have to grapple with. And I think that that's one of the reasons why these series are doing something new, because it's like we've moved on from having to grapple and now we can just be.
It reminds me of something, Esther, I think it's Rabbi Brous, right? She says, we're no longer surviving, we're now thriving. Like this Jewish mentality, right? She said that.
I mean, I think a lot of people say that because it rhymes. I often wondered if people would still say that if it didn't rhyme.
But it's like, it's this like Jewish idea that when you're no longer running, you're no longer, like you're not in that headspace anymore. We're not in shtetl life anymore. We are now like grounded. And that mindset is not the same anymore. So now we do have the opportunity to kind of unpack all of those things that brought us to this moment. And I love that. I feel like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend does a great, very interesting job dealing with all of those things and also making it like a musical.
Well, and there are so many layers to it too, because she spends like the first 3 seasons out of 4. So like 75% of the series she spends without a diagnosis and without any sort of awareness of why she sees things the way they are. And so we only see things through her kind of like myopic lens where it's like, oh, Jewish suffering, Jewish trauma, intergenerational, problems. This is why I am the way that I am. And then the series just blows that up and we get something in the end that's so much better. And so sort of moves beyond that kind of like heartbreak kid, she's got to get out of New York and she's got to go and get herself a non-Jewish partner because that's the way that she's going to like normalize. It becomes so much more nuanced, which is what she says.
We could talk about this show for forever, but I think that, where you talked about the first 3 seasons versus like the 4th season, I think it's like midway through the 3rd season, it's like it becomes clear that we're watching something extremely sophisticated because Rebecca and the characters are all growing. They're all turning into different people. In one case, the case of Greg, literally being portrayed by a different actor, which wasn't their choice. I think they decided to do that in a different way, but I think that symbolically it works as well. This show really operates as like on a number of levels, but the 3 musical moments that I think about the most, and I've presented on this at various places, is the Jap battle rap, obviously. Then Where's the Bathroom, which is, obviously it's chaotic, it's frantic, it's high pitched, it's very familiar, but it's also like very disturbing how much she embodies this particular thing. Then Remember That We Suffered, which is, I think, just a mind-blowing condemnation of previous generations who have focused the entirety of Jewish identity on survival and post-Holocaust triumph. And that's the reason, and then you have to marry a Jew, and that's the reason you have to have Jewish babies. And that's because it's all about this replacement, not the replacement theory of the anti-Semites who, they're trying to replace ourselves. Like, that's really what it is. And I also think that there's in previous generations, I'm saying this as a generalization, obviously, but many more people did not leave their communities. Like they weren't necessarily in imposed ghettos or shtetls, but, where they grew up is kind of where they ended up settling. And I think that young women in particular were not able to take those kinds of journeys unless they were, whisked away by a husband to the big city, which I think is the Rose Weissman story. Because she was from Oklahoma, I believe. We find out, much like Lynn Schusterman, who is a professorship that you hold. Anyway, but I think, what I want to say is that I am a person who moved from New Jersey and New York to California. And nearly everyone I went to high school with in New Jersey stayed in New Jersey or New York, or they went to Israel. I believe that I am the only one from my high school class in California. And my high school class was very small. I went to Yeshiva Day School, but like the idea of like going across the country to figure out, who are you when you're not like in the middle of this community of people who have known you your entire life and who accept you or condemn you for whatever your choices have been in the past. Like it's really a chance for a clean slate. Although I am not like Rebecca Bunch in that I didn't move to West Covina to become the only Jew in West Covina. I think that in some ways is, if Rebecca had moved to Los Angeles to Pico Robertson, like that's a different show. And that's definitely not the show that we're watching, because part of what Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is that she's just this totally exotic creature who has moved into this space where nobody understands her, but she's chasing some particular goal, in this particular case, romance. But it's really about chasing who she is as a person. And that's ultimately what she arrives at. So anyway, that was, again, not a question.
No, but I think it's such an important observation. And I think one of the other things that the series does that's really cool is it takes a very common trope of Jewishness and Jewish representation, the fish out of water, and it turns it on its head so that like she's exotic, she's foreign, like in the first episode, Daryl, her new boss, like calls her his Jew in a way that feels very sort of unsavory. And it's like you see the kind of discomfort that she could be feeling, but she just keeps on with who she is. There's no attempt to kind of make herself like anybody else. She just continues being who she is. And like, there's that moment in the Jap Battle rap when Audra, her rival, first comes to California for that case. There's a moment in the rap where Audra says something about something being a shanda, and Rebecca actually pauses and says, that means disgrace. I'm translating for the goys. And it's like the fact that they're the out group who needs the translating and we're the in group who gets it without having it translated, I think is something that is so sort of special. It's like it takes all of that fish out of water and it turns it on its head. We don't have to feel like we need to temper ourselves, temper our Jewishness, temper our like cultural specificity. We can use the language that we want to use, speak the way that we want to speak, make the references that we want to make. And if people understand what the matzah ball is, or, know what a birthright trip is, or understand any of the myriad references that they make in that song, then they're speaking the language of the show. And if they don't know any of those things, that means that they just don't, they're missing out. And I think that that's kind of cool, the way that the series really sort of turns that fish out of water dynamic on its head. That I think is something that's new. Because even in a series like The Nanny, for example, where you have, she's the fish out of water, but she's also the central focus of the series. And she teaches the family to be more like her, more warm, sort of more Jewish in that way. There's still all of the kind of translation where you can sense the writers and the showrunners being okay, we need to make sure that this is appealing to mainstream audiences. And with Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, it's we don't care if this is appealing to anybody. People who understand the codes are going to get it.
Right.
And that's who this show is for.
There's that phrase in Hebrew, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but hamevin yavin, which is IYKYK. If you know, you know. That's really what it is. And obviously, the Jap Battle Rap is just an amazing work of specificity in terms of depicting the generational influences, Jewish influences that somebody of her age would have. Again, I feel like maybe when next time Rachel Bloom creates a series that has a profoundly Jewish protagonist, we will look forward to talking with you more about that in comparison with Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. But we also want to talk about the marvelous Mrs. Maisel. So the women of Maisel are interesting, and there are obviously a number of them. There's obviously Midge Maisel, who's, we are told in the title, is marvelous. We have Susie, who is her manager and bestie and critic sometimes. We have Rose and Shirley, who are Midge's mother and mother-in-law, respectively. And we have Astrid, the proudest and most connected Jewish woman of them all, who is also a Jew by choice. So I'm wondering if we can just talk about some of these characters a little bit. Do any of them fit your definition of unapologetic? And in what may be the same or a different question, who best represents Jewish women?
I have a lot of feelings about the marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and so at any point,
we do too.
Yeah, stop me if I go off on too much of a tangent. But I think in terms of Jewish female representation, Midge is the only character on that show that I actually think would fall sort of under the umbrella of an unapologetic Jewish woman. I think that out of everybody, she, by the nature of her doing stand-up and just the way that we see her sort of being able to speak for herself and represent herself and understand herself through that medium, I think that she's an extremely interesting and well-rounded character. I think that the way that the show sort of plays with some of the sort of stereotypes of the Jewish American princess with her fashion and her kind of interest in how she looks and her measuring the circumference of her thighs and things like that, but then sort of moves beyond that to show that she actually has a lot of depth and a lot of interiority and, you know, is sort of proud of who she is and where she comes from and not afraid to be herself and own her Jewishness and claim it and, like, you know, make fun of it and everything like that. I think that she's a great character. I think one of the weaknesses of the show is that they're so intent on letting us know how marvelous Midge is that they don't want anybody else to be. And so, like, a character like Susie, for example, she technically is Jewish. It's not really something that the series ever allows for her to be explicitly because she doesn't actually fit a conception of what a Jewish person is supposed to be. Like, she's genuinely poor and she's struggling. She doesn't fit any of the stereotypes. And, you know, there's a sort of implicit kind of queerness to her as well that the series also doesn't want to explore. And it's just kind of like she's sort of left in the shadows as this quasi-Jewish, quasi-queer, not really fitting into any of the archetypes character that the show basically just uses as a platform for Midge. You know, she's a sounding board, she's a mirror, she's a critic, she's a friend, but she's not like a person in her own right in the same way. And then with Rose and Shirley, they fall so clearly into the kind of two archetypes of Jewish motherhood that come from the like 1950s, 1960s moment. Shirley is much more of like a kind of Sophie Portnoy, lower middle class, kind of still entrenched in like the old neighborhood, but moving her way up, but doing so in a way that's loud and brash and wearing a fur coat in the middle of summer and screaming about soup flavors in the street for her grandson. And Rose is like the kind of Goodbye Columbus, upper middle class, already made it and assimilated, like cold, calculating, social climbing, insistent on basically being as sort of like prim and proper and waspish as she possibly can be. And like they sort of deviate a little bit from these roles over the course of the series, but they stay pretty firmly entrenched who they are and what they're supposed to represent. And I think with the Weissmans and the Maisels, Amy Sherman Palladino just perpetuates this kind of like post-war assimilationist narrative. There are high Jews and low Jews, and like, you know, the high Jews have already sort of assimilated and kind of shed themselves of their ethnic otherness. The low Jews are still marked by that otherness. And so they're less acceptable and sort of more visible in a way that troubles the other characters.
And they're all played by Jews. Like,
yes.
The Maisel family, they are all Jewish in real life, and the assimilated Jews are played by non-Jews. And I don't think they did that intentionally. I just feel like it works. I'm like, all right, I'm buying into it. Like, I get it. But it's like a crazy thing that it's like all and then none.
Well, also imagine it flipped. Like flipped when Shirley and Moish, if they are played by non-Jewish people, with those characterizations, it becomes caricaturish and kind of Jew-facey. So I guess, you know, I don't know if they did like intentionally made that line when they were doing casting that these people need to look a certain way and these people need to behave a certain way. And so I don't think it was, like you said, Erin, I don't think it was intentional. But if you think about what it would have looked like flipped, it would have been bad, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's so reflective, like, of Amy Sherman Palladino's sort of ethos anyway. Like, even in Gilmore Girls, she loves having a central protagonist who's really like the hero and everybody else is kind of a weird caricature. And it's like a snow globe kind of fantasy version of reality where everybody's supposed to fulfill some kind of archetype. And ultimately everything uplifts the central female protagonist so that she's better than everyone else. And they did it with Rory and Lorelai, and they're doing it with Midge. And I think it's at a disservice to the series in general. I think that Midge could continue to be marvelous if the other characters around her were allowed to be more human.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it's a stylistic choice. And so I don't know. Amy Sherman Palladino didn't ask me. So
growing up, the first time I ever felt seen on TV was watching Gilmore Girls. Even though they're not Jewish, Lorelai and Rory just felt like the ideal mother-daughter relationship that I wanted. Like for my, like, not that my mom was horrible, but like when I grew up, I wanted to have a daughter like Rory, and I was going to be like Lorelai. And the way that they spoke to each other in references and then never needed to catch a breath for air, like it felt so Jewish. And like even their knowledge on Jewish culture was like very like deep. And I was like, how do you know this? You live in Connecticut. There's no Jews in Stars Hollow. Like, how do you know this? And it's so funny that you bring them up, because I started doing like in elementary school, and you did like a text to text comparison. So that way you could like expand your mind to say, oh, this is like that. I started doing this with Maisel and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. And for some reason, I started putting like Shirley Maisel and Paula from Crazy Ex-Girlfriend in the same category. Like their warmth, their larger than life, I will run into the street and save you and also give you chicken soup. Like they just felt very similar. And in the book, you make a whole case for why Paula is a great Jewish mom, even though she's not a mom. Like she's not.
No, Paula's
Jewish.
She's totally a Jewish mother.
Right.
She's a Catholic Jewish mother.
Right. And it's crazy because they really try and make her not Jewish, but she still is, as a way to kind of be the foil to Naomi at some points. But also like Rose and Naomi are also, I put them in like the same category because they are both kind of acting in that way. Like maybe even Rose is the mother to Naomi. I'm not really sure how that timeline works out, but like it feels like one begets the other. And then I put like the Crazy Ex-Girlfriend girl group, and then Midge and Imogen. Like, I'm not sure why Midge doesn't have any Jewish friends that she likes.
No, they don't let her. And like, the thing that I also find really frustrating is like, they don't let her meet any female comedians. And like Joan Rivers would have been performing in Greenwich Village nightclubs at the exact same time that Midge is canonically in the show. And it's like, we get to meet Lenny Bruce. Like we get to go down that rabbit hole why can't we have like Joan Rivers as a cool best friend, or like somebody Joan Rivers asked? It's so disappointing that she can't have like a single Jewish female friend.
Yeah, it's weird. And it's also not just in Maisel. Like in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, her best friends are not Jewish. And then her one Jewish best friend, they kind of have a truce at the end of the series. But it's like kind of disappointing because it's like, oh, okay, so Jews, in order to be successful, especially Jewish women, they can't be in a place where they're competing against each other.
And like Jewish female spaces are always spaces that are contentious and like dangerous. And like the Jewish woman has to find non-Jewish female spaces in order to find comfort and support and love and female friendship. And it's really strange. And it's one of the things that kind of drives me crazy about both of the series. They kind of, I think, even as Rebecca and Midge are such like groundbreaking Jewish female characters, I think both series ultimately feed into the idea that like there are good Jews and bad Jews, and the good Jews are less Jewish and the bad Jews are more visibly Jewish, and what's considered Jewish is inherently negative. And it's like that sort of messaging is so frustrating. And it's one of the reasons why like I love Broad City so much.
Yeah.
Because it does all of the same character building as Maisel and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, but it does it without any of the shame. And it's like Alana's relationship with her mother, Abby's relationship with her mother, all of those things. It's like Jewish female spaces become safe and warm. And the idea of becoming like your mother isn't scary. And like, I don't know, it just sort of rehabilitates Jewish femininity and allows for more than one Jewish woman to exist on screen at a time without there being conflict.
Mm-hmm. And two things, and one of them is like an aside. To your point, even the relationship that Lorelai has with Emily feels very negatively Jewish. Like,
oh yeah,
even though like, you know, maybe she's not such a heinous bitch after all, says, you know, like the normal way girls hate their mom, right? Like we know that the mother-daughter, you know, butting heads is not necessarily Jewish, but there's like a type of trauma that for some reason Jewish women have with each other that you either get like the open arms bubala or the that's what you're wearing today. It's like, it's literally one or the other. And sometimes you get the hybrid, but it's like, it's very scary. And maybe it feels that way because it's always perpetuated in pop culture that's what you feel like.
I think it's a self-perpetuating cycle. We see these images, we internalize them to be true. We read them into our own relationships and interactions and lives. And then it kind of just like goes around and around and around. I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting that it kind of keeps being perpetuated almost in a way where it's like now we're at a point where it's like, well, young Jewish women can be nuanced and fully human and round, but we still have this intergenerational conflict where it's like, well, somebody has to be the problem. So it might as well be the mother.
We also have some questions from listeners. Some of our listeners are also very concerned about these ideas of representation, about how Jewish characters are portrayed. So I wanted to ask you one in which the listener said, which Jewish characters have set us back? And specifically, like, what do you think of Larry David's approach to Jewish women? For instance, Susie Essman, Susie, what's her last name on the show? Green.
Yeah.
Right, Susie Green.
I love Susie Essman. And so if Susie Essman somehow listens to this, I apologize to her. I can't stand the portrayal of Susie Green. I love Curb Your Enthusiasm. I think Larry David, I think his comedy is brilliant. And if I was a Jewish man, I would be able to watch that show without even giving it a second thought. But as a Jewish woman, every time Susie comes on screen, I laugh because it's Susie Essman and she's amazing and she's funny. But I also cringe because I know that everything that she's communicating and embodying is just everything that we don't need people to attribute to Jewish women anymore. I think one of the big problems with Jewish stereotypes, and especially Jewish female stereotypes, because I think with Jewish male stereotypes, they tend to be a little bit more positive. And so the fact that the traits are kind of conflated with Jewishness it's not great, but it doesn't matter as much. With Jewish female stereotypes, there's such a weird kind of conflation where it's like, well, all Jewish women are like this. Like all mothers are Jewish mothers, like somehow being kind of loud and brash and overbearing and domineering and all of these things that have nothing to do with any specific ethnic identity or religious identity or cultural identity are coded as Jewish within like our popular culture. And that character for me embodies every single negative association that pop culture has been like pushing on audiences about what Jewish women are and what they are the way they are because they are Jewish, like for the past 40, 50 years. And so I love Susie Essman. I do not love that character. And I think she's definitely an example of a character who sets us back, especially because in that show, because it's Larry David and because it's HBO, it's so much more explicitly Jewish than something like Friends, where you have like, Rachel Green is sort of like a gentle variation of the Jap. And especially in the early seasons, she's not necessarily doing anything for us, but it's so like implicit that she's Jewish that it's almost more palatable. Whereas with Curb Your Enthusiasm, it's like, every time Susie comes in the room, it's like they might as well just have a neon sign blinking, Jewish woman, Jewish woman, Jewish woman. And it just feels really pejorative.
And Susie Essman in particular is interesting because, as you said, she is funny. Susie, we love you. We love you. We love you. Anyway, assuming that she's found this podcast. But Susie on Curb is a very extreme and shrill and annoying and loud and overbearing character. Susie Essman is probably not like that in person, although her voice is the same. And, so I think when we hear her voice, we associate it with that character in Curb Your Enthusiasm. But she also plays Alana's mother on Broad City. And while some of the characterizations I would say are similar in terms of the way she dresses or in terms of, she's a much more loving character.
Oh, yeah.
And much more admirable, much more somebody who's a role model for Alana, for her daughter, and not an annoying, overbearing kind of person. Like she wants her approval. She wants to hang out with her. They have, great mother-daughter chemistry. So
I do have a question, like a baby follow question for you here. Do you think in the same way that in order for Midge to be marvelous, everyone else has to be reduced? Do you think because Larry David needs to be not marvelous, but he needs to be Larry David, and in order for him to do that, everyone else needs to also be a caricature?
I think that it's slightly different from that. I think with Susie, there's definitely a sense of that. And I think that the show very much sort of revolves around them as like diametrically opposed enemies. And so she needs to be this kind of mythic villain in order for him to kind of represent the sort of amoral center of the show. But I think when you look at the way that the other characters are sort of communicated, they're all caricatures to an extent, but I think that they're allowed to be sympathetic in a way she never is. Like Jeff is maybe one of the worst husbands who's ever existed in the history of modern television. Yeah. And like there's an episode, and I don't remember which season it is, but there's like an episode where you found out that like he cheated on her and Larry like finds out. And I don't remember the exact plot line, but the whole thing is basically like, well, yeah, why wouldn't he? She's awful. And it's like, that's the sort of perspective that's communicated. And I think ultimately it really is all about perspective. Cause like Susie Essman's portrayal of Alana's mother has a lot of the same characteristics as Susie Green on Curb, but the perspective of the series and the sort of sense of Jewish female self-representation, as opposed to having like men represent them, it's so much softer. She's allowed to be so much more human and real. And so even when she's kind of like being a bit over the top, there's a reason, there's a moment, there's a conversation that unpacks it. And then you realize like, oh, like the episode with Alana's grandmother's Shiva. Bobby, Alana's mother, like goes crazy for these like knockoff purses. And she like basically ignores the Shiva so that she can go like shopping for purses in the Lower East Side. And it's crazy. And it's weird. And she's very intense about it. And ultimately, like the episode goes in a direction where Alana helps her to realize that she's really just using the purses as a coping mechanism because she's so sad about the loss of her mother. And the whole thing becomes this like really warm and lovely, but still very sort of classic Broad City irreverent take on like intergenerational Jewish female relationships and like love and the love between mothers and daughters and like grandmothers. And it's just like, it's a beautiful episode that has all of the kind of like Susie Essman character traits that you would expect, but spun in a way that allows for her to be a sympathetic human being with interiority. And I think that's something that Curb Your Enthusiasm does not allow her, but does allow the other side characters.
Okay, you read our mind again.
Yes, exactly. So our other question from a listener is that about Jewish men and their role in creating these Jewish women characters. So the question really is, what has the role of Jewish men been in the on-screen representation of women, and what forces within the community or within the Jewish community or within broader American society shaped how they wrote those characters?
So I think that in terms of the creation of like the Jap and the Jewish mother, which I talked about a little earlier, those stereotypes were created by Jewish men, Jewish male authors, comedians, filmmakers, and really just kind of embedded into popular culture. The post-war period, like especially the 60s into the 70s, was a moment in American popular culture where Jews were actually able to create Jewish stories. Because basically from like the jazz singer in like the late 20s, basically the jazz singer was like the last very specifically Jewish film that Hollywood made. And then there's like this big gap where there are basically like no Jewish films, or there are Jewish films like Gentleman's Agreement, where everything's kind of filtered through the lens of a non-Jewish protagonist. And the Jews are sort of these like side character victims. The 60s and the 70s are like a moment where Jews are finally able to actually be on American screens, but it's usually Jewish men, and it's usually Jewish men running away from their mothers or their Jewish girlfriends or wives to achieve Americanness and become more normal. And I think that that's kind of the cultural moment where you first have the sort of widespread mainstream normalization of this idea that to be Jewish is to be confined. And in order to achieve happiness and normalcy, one must run away. And it's the men who get to run away, and it's the women that they're running away from. And so that, I think, is why when you watch films and even TV, but more so films, and read, books from that time period, the male characters are allowed to, they're having more fun. Like this sort of schlemiel, everyman kind of character. Like, yes, he's a lovable loser. Yes, he sometimes doesn't get the girl, but we're relating to him. We're understanding him. We're hearing directly from him. And he's telling his own story and shaping the narrative so that we root for him. And he's having a great time doing it. And Jewish female characters don't really get to have fun until Jewish women are the ones at the helm of their stories. And so, with something like Rhoda, for example, that's in the 70s at the height of this kind of like Jap fever, but she's not a princess. And she's not a princess because the head writer in the writer's room of Rhoda, the spinoff that she gets from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, is a Jewish woman. And 8 Jewish women wrote for Rhoda. And so like, she speaks directly to the camera. She tells us who she is, and she's relatable and sort of schlemielized as a result. And I think that that's sort of, I don't know, it speaks to the importance of self-representation and of people actually being able to write and convey their own stories. Because I think the gender components really it's complicated. And I think that especially in the kind of assimilation framework, and this isn't just true for Jews, it's really true for all, minority groups, ethnic minorities, racial minorities, what have you. There are very sort of clear patterns where men, because they're only marked different in one way, like, a Jewish man is only different because he's Jewish, he's able to more easily kind of assimilate into the mainstream than a Jewish woman who's othered from two perspectives. She's other as both Jew and woman. And so the kind of way that Jewish men assimilate is by pointing out the Jewishness and the unacceptability of the Jewish woman, which is where these archetypes come from. It's basically like, I'm acceptable and I'm normal, and now I'm going to remove myself from this other person that I can kind of point out their flaws and everything about them that marks them as different, and separate those differences on the basis of gender, because that's the thing we don't have in common. And so I hope that answers the question.
I think so.
Okay.
What unapologetic Jewish characters never made the book that you wished you could have fit in?
Oh, that's a really good question. I wish that I could have talked about Fleischman is in Trouble in the book. The book was out by the time Fleischman came out. And so there wasn't a way for that to happen. And really, Fleischman isn't really a comedy. And so it wouldn't have necessarily fit per se anyway. But I really enjoyed the way that the series unfolded Rachel and Libby's characters.
Yeah.
I thought it was really powerful and really well done. And I think it's sort of like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend in the sense that it acknowledges the stereotypes. It shows that people often live according to archetypes that they've internalized, and then it completely demolishes them in a way that I think is really sophisticated and very well done. If Fleischman had come out like a year ago, it would have been in the book, and I wish that I had been able to delve into that, but I guess, I don't know, volume 2.
Volume 2, right.
Sounds great. We're on board.
I hope there's so many more things that you can do, like an encyclopedia on this.
I mean, from your mouth to God's ears.
Thank you so much for being with us today. It's really
Thank you. I had a
pleasure.
great time. I had a really great time. This was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure.
And before you go, if you were a bagel, what kind of bagel would you be?
I do have an answer to this. Ready, locked, and loaded.
Okay.
I would be an egg everything, because I love an everything bagel, but I like when it has the egg base.
I love that answer.
Interesting.
Instead of the plain base. It's really good. And you put chive cream cheese on it. And then you don't talk to anybody for the rest of the day because your breath will be terrible.
There's this place called Boychik's Bagels, which I've never been to, but people keep saying like it's the best bagel on the West Coast. So I'm going to have to check that out. But they have something called an egg free thing bagel, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's an egg base with the everything seasoning. So it's just funny that you said that. It was just in my brain from yesterday.
No, it's really good. I highly recommend. The best one I've ever had was at like the H&H Bagels in the Upper East Side. But I'm from Massachusetts originally, and there's a local bagel shop called Life's a Bagel in the town that I grew up in that has that flavor, and that's like how I discovered it. And yeah, it's really good.
Well, we have our marching orders set for us for our next breakfast.
This has been The Bagel Report, a production of Jay, the Jewish News of Northern California, and a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network. Thank you to Lev Gringaz, our producer from Jew Folk Inc., David A.M. Walensky and Andrew Essenston, and Danny Lipsky for creating our logo. You can find us wherever podcasts are listened to. Connect with us on social, on Twitter, at Esther K, at Eben Moshe, and at The Bagel Report, on Instagram at Esther Kostanowitz, at Eben Moshe, and TBR the Pod, and by emailing us at thebagelreport@gmail.com. Now go and watch something interesting, and maybe we'll talk about it next time on The Bagel Report.